Your friends are scrolling through short content, but you, my friend, you're here to learn. Welcome to the RAAAZ Clips.
You interviewed Rajiv Chandrasekhar. I had exactly his job.
Yeah.
And, I was overseeing the National E-Governance Plan of India, what was then called NEGP, which was largely the focus was how do you reduce the interface between the citizen and government to make the citizen, to ensure that the citizen is able to access services as quickly as possible, to ensure that there's no corruption. And the challenge for me was that we had debated a lot of policies on e-governance. But then I realized that we need quick wins. We need to demonstrate that we can give citizens, guarantee citizens, access to public services as quickly and effectively as possible. And two very exciting schemes that were rolled out by the Ministry of IT were the Passport Seva Kendra and the online filing of income tax returns. And those were humongous, game-changing legislations and policy changes, because prior to Passport Seva Kendra, a citizen, when they wanted to have their passport renewed or they wanted to get extra pages on their passport to travel overseas, they had to try and get access to their member of parliament, who in turn would write to the passport office, and the passport office may or may not entertain their request, and they had to wait in a long line, and there was no guarantee that they would get that service. Passport Seva Kendra is outsourced to TCS, which is one of the biggest IT companies in the world, run by the Tata Group. They implement it on behalf of the government. They charge a fee, obviously, and the citizen within a few days' time gets a passport renewed, and they get it quickly. No corruption, no waiting, no running behind somebody, some politician or clerk or a babu. You get it done quickly. Same thing with filing of income tax returns. So, and those are schemes which have expanded over time into even faceless returns, where now you can file your returns, and if there's a query and an assessing officer says that if you've paid X amount of tax, I think you owe us Y amount of tax. That's done in a faceless way to eliminate corruption. So I do recall, in a funny way, that when we were in power and there was this debate about Lokpal, and a lot of people felt that Lokpal was the solution to fight corruption. And I would always say that Lokpal as a legislation is one thing, that it has its merits, but the way to fight corruption is to make government smaller and more efficient, not to make government bigger.
You mean the government businesses, government-run businesses?
I mean the interface between citizen and bureaucrat or citizen and politician. If you eliminate layers, if a citizen needs a public service, the citizen needs a passport renewed, the citizen needs an LPG cylinder. If you can eliminate layers between that citizen to get that service, you need permission. Let's say you have a restaurant and you want permission from the municipality of your particular city. If you can eliminate the number of layers through which your file moves, you reduce corruption. It's controversial.
Yeah. No, it's
and
also mathematical. It's very basic.
But exactly. So small government is the answer to fighting corruption, in my opinion. Today, for instance, now there's a topic called disinvestment. Should the taxpayer of India be funding loss-making public enterprises, state-owned enterprises? Now, for example, as a country, we've privatized Air India. I'm all for it. But again, it's an example of large government. Can the government run a hotel better than the private sector? Can the government ensure that every person who's staying at that government-owned hotel is a paying resident and a paying guest? It doesn't work that way. Someone down in the system will say, this is my friend, give him a free room, or give him a free seat on my plane. And that's how you encourage corruption.
Yeah, my reading of this, again, this is based on a lot of the historical podcasts we've done, is that the British effed shit up for us when they were leaving a little bit. They systematically wrecked a lot of stuff, kept all these layers, ensured that we were a ripe ecosystem for corruption. And then whatever governments came in power since the British left probably saw the corruption conducive architecture and said, let's leave it as it is. And because there was that much money to be made. And the thing is, even today, there's that much extra money to be made. So as a young Indian, I'm a little, I want to say a little skeptical and a little bit curious to see how corruption is actually removed from the system. Of course, I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic. That's all of young India. But practically, how do you remove corruption? Because there's a lot of money to be made in the system.
Look, if the truth is to remove corruption, ultimately, if it takes two hands to clap, if the person who is acquiring a government service wants to pay money, if someone gets caught driving on the wrong side of the road and a traffic policeman pulls him or her over, if that person doesn't want a ticket and doesn't want to pay a fine and wants to pay the policeman, it takes two hands to clap. That person is also aiding, abetting corruption. But the easiest way to eliminate, now, for example, in Mumbai, let's say, you have CCTV cameras. They immediately know with the radar how fast you're going. You automatically get a notification that you've been fined. There's no interface between the driver and the policeman.
Remove the human factor.
You remove the human interface completely. So this was controversial when I would talk about it. But as part of the National E-Governance Plan, this was a huge mission for me, which was how do you use e-governance to just eliminate that human interface? And the minute you do it, in every sector, you will see corruption go down. But where I would little disagree with you is, when the British left us, they left us bankrupt. They left us as a country where the literacy rate was so low, the infant mortality rate was so high, the life expectancy was so low. And at that time, the government had to build many of these sectors and these companies. They had to be state-owned. We didn't have, for instance, a robust private sector. We had hardly a few companies in the private sector, the Birla Group, the Bajaj Group, who were there pre-independence. So you needed government to be in every business. But today you don't need government to be in every business. Today the private sector has come of age in India. And if you look at a sector like defense, we are still as a country subsidizing the economies of Russia, of Israel, of America, of France. Today the private sector has come of age.
Yeah.
Today there's no reason why the L&Ts of the world, and you have so many engineering companies, cannot build world-class defense companies that are not just sustaining our domestic indigenous requirements, but that can become net exporters. The same is true, let's say, of a sector like space. The space sector has opened up, which I find very encouraging. We're a little late as compared, let's say, to the United States. But I think that in India, this is an area which we can also compete. For instance, in drones, in robotics, these are areas which are going to be at the crossover between military use and civilian use. One interesting statistic we have in our defense, in the defense ministry, there's an agency called DRDO, which is the Defense Research Development Organization. And the DRDO was set up, if I'm not mistaken, on the same year as DARPA in the United States, which stands for Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Now, DARPA went on to create the internet. And DRDO has not really come up with something groundbreaking in terms of innovation. So I think these are areas now where we have a robust private sector, where we can use the private sector to work in conjunction with the government and innovate.
I don't know who had brought this up, but someone had brought this up on the show. They said, I think DRDO has something like 80,000 employees or some huge number of employees. So what are 80,000 people doing there? Like, why are they on a payroll?
Yeah, but look, the reason DARPA has succeeded as compared to a DRDO in defense, and the reason DARPA were to came up with the internet, they invented the internet, was because they interfaced very well with universities and with the private sector. They didn't function and operate in a silo where it was government bureaucrats sitting and deciding, should we invest in research for a mosquito repellent? Should we invest in research for a tank? They were working with the private sector. So those are the things that we need to change. And I think that India is at a cusp now because of what's happening with China, in my opinion. There's a very big strategic advantage that we have, a very big strategic tailwind. And with the private sector in the country that's come of age, I think it's very critical for us as a country, especially in strategic areas like defense, in space, to ensure that DRDO, ISRO are working very closely with universities, with academics, and with the private sector. I've been a minister of telecommunications where we had a company called BSNL and MTNL. They still exist. And I recall, it's a funny story. I remember once there was a question in Parliament about the lack of good services of MTNL and BSNL. MTNL really caters to Mumbai and Delhi, BSNL to the rest of India. And there was a question by MPs about why is MTNL and BSNL's quality of service so poor compared to the private sector. And I would say my ministry, we were getting kind of trolled by MPs. And the joke was that MTNL, they were saying that, you in the ministry, you people think that MTNL stands for Mahanagar Telephone Nigam Limited. Actually, it stands for Mera Telephone Nahi Lagta Hai. And BSNL, which the real name of BSNL is Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited. And they said, गाँव में लोग क्या कहते हैं कि BSNL means भाई साहब नहीं लगता है. And, so I do recall when that happened, and I was very, very upset, angry. I went to my office, my ministry office, to Sanchar Bhavan, which is the headquarters of the Department of Telecommunications. And I immediately called all the officers, the CM, the managing directors of these companies. And I looked at successive reports that BSNL, MTNL's quality of service and TRAI, which is the regulator, monitors these, is the lowest compared to everyone in the private sector. And when I asked them why, I quickly realized that no government, no person who's in charge of these companies, the MDs, didn't want to do what was right for the company, because the fear was if they did something and bought the right equipment, which may have been more expensive, or they placed their tower on top of a building which may have cost more money to them, they feared that there would be a CVC inquiry, which is the Central Vigilance Commission. There would be a CBI inquiry. And they were like, I don't want to do anything. So there was no buy-in from them to feel that we own this company and we have a sense of ownership in this company.
Why would there be an inquiry?
People are afraid. Somebody will make an accusation that why did you buy these microphones? Why didn't you buy a cheaper microphone?
Like the opposition might say something?
Not just the opposition, somebody will complain. So people, so bureaucrats and people who are in charge of certain companies are sometimes afraid to take decisions because they're afraid that if we take a decision, which may be in the company's long-term interest, someone could say, why did you do this? And so the answer to me was very simple, that as long as government runs these companies, ultimately, can government provide a sense of ownership to the management of these companies? Can government tell a Indian telecommunications service officer who is the CMD of a company like BSNL, I want to give you full power. Go and fight in the marketplace. Ensure that you compete against all the private rivals. Okay. Are you willing to give them that freedom? And it's very tough for the government to do that. Because even if the government says, I'm giving you full freedom, if that person is afraid, that person won't take a decision. And the same is true of every sector. Then on top of that, there is another big problem, which is a B2C business, a business to consumer business is very different. It's architecturally very different from a B2B business. So let's say there's a company like ONGC, which is exploring for oil and gas. They're essentially selling to refiners. It's largely a B2B business. You and I as consumers don't ever interface with ONGC. But say Air India, before it was sold to the Tatas, it was a B2C business. We were flying on Air India. We wanted to get the best experience. We had many airlines to compete with Air India. We were looking at what kind of food they had, what systems they had to inform us if the flight was delayed, for instance, how affordable their prices were, how well maintained their planes were, how clean they were. In the B2C space, it's very, very tough for the government to compete. It's very tough. It's very tough to get the customer service that you get in a public insurance company as compared to what you'd get in a private insurance company. It's very tough to get the customer service you'll get in a private airline as compared to when Air India was public. Despite all our problems, despite whatever controversies have happened in the past, our telecom story, our internet story, the fact that you and I are talking on this channel and that the market share of podcasts and YouTubers is growing in comparison to traditional mediums like television or DTH, in fact, higher in some cases than it is in American and Western democracies, tells you that our internet telecom story has worked, regardless of which party is in power. There have been tweakings here and there. There have been controversies here and there. Different governments have gotten into different controversies. The aviation industry, for instance, also a very good example, where today you have a very healthy, very robust aviation industry. You have fares that are affordable, where today if somebody wants to travel from Mumbai to, let's say, rural Uttar Pradesh, it could sometimes, depending on which sector, depending on when you book the ticket, you could get a one-way ticket at a cheaper price, if not the same price as you would get a railway ticket. And timing, there's no comparison. If you look at the insurance industry, there was a time, well before you were born, where the only way someone could buy life insurance was through the government monopoly LIC. The only way you could insure your car, for example, or your motorbike was through a government monopoly, through many of GIC and its subsidiaries. Today, think of how many private insurers there are. I don't want to name them, but there are so many private insurers. Think of the customer service you're getting. Back in the day, just for your information, when 30, 40 years ago, if you banged your car into another car, nobody asked the other person for insurance papers. You just basically, two people got into a fist fight, and the guy who won, the other person had to pay for that damage. Nobody went and processed an insurance claim because they knew to process the claim, there would be corruption. It would take a long time to process that claim. Today, you can technically, if someone hits your car, you don't even have to know who's hit your car. Your insurance will process it in 1 second when it goes to the mechanic and you repair your car. Now, that's an example of how services have changed for the better. So these three are good examples of where if you lower the share of government, the market share, none of these sectors, the government's market share is zero, by the way. In aviation, it's zero now. But in telecom and in insurance, they still have market share. But when you reduce the government's market share from a monopoly to a minimal share, and you expand the private sector's market share, you get innovation. And that innovation ultimately translates to you and me, the customer. So I'm excited that even in a sector like defense, there's no reason why we can't do that. Where we reduce the government's, we don't shut down companies, but we reduce their market share because you're growing the pie. In insurance, by the way, when insurance sector was open to the private sector, the allegation was LIC will die. But LIC today is doing very well. Its revenue has grown, its market cap has grown, but its market share has reduced. Obviously, because its market share was 100% during monopolistic times and now it's come down. But the pie has gotten bigger. So I'm not sure what LIC's market share is. Let's say it's 40%. But if LIC's market share is 40%, that 40% is worth much more than 100% was 20 or 30 or 40 years earlier. Or what it would have been if we had not liberalized the insurance sector.
Man, I honestly now see why they say that you're a possible PM candidate. Like after getting to know you. This is not the end of the episode. But you speak with a lot of clarity. And there's a lot of research and there's a lot of work that's gone on in your life, honestly. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out this playlist for more videos just like this. It's TRS Clips.